Last time on D&D, The Arrival, Session 1. So, my homebrew world has probably existed for well over 30 years. So when I first started DMing, I basically created a world, and that same world has pretty much been consistent. And it has just evolved over time and taken different influences from different things. For example, a big influence on my world was a series of computer games called Realms of Arcania. I actually enjoyed how they set up their gods and stuff like that, so that had a heavy influence on how I set up my gods in my world. But the continent and everything like that had pretty much stayed the same. Some of the names have evolved over time because some of them were very generic, I guess you could say. When I decided DM for 5th edition for the Arrival group, I decided to create a brand new continent, basically start everything fresh, but still keep it in the same world because I had all this history written up and all this other stuff. I already had the gods all laid out. So just basically a new continent where I could, as a DM, just open up and explore more on this continent. And the idea was generally that a new continent's discovered and, there's all these resources coming from there, kind of like sort of the gold rush type thing, but it's actually like magic weapons are coming up from there, like old magic weapons that have never been seen before and stuff like that. People were going to this new continent to find their riches, become rich and famous, sail back to the main continent and just basically sell off and retire. And it was generally known as the Ivory Coast. When I made this, basically the idea was Ivory Coast was this, it's a bay that you basically sail into where these massive bones are poking out and you're sailing under these bones that looks like a giant rib cage that has just been sitting in the water. So, perhaps like a giant dragon of enormous magnitude had died there. And now the rib cage basically made this huge thing that you kind of sail into. This is how it started with Session 1. The voyage aboard the Starjammer was a pleasant one, until you were a few days out of the Ivory Vale, where the skies turned dark and stormy and the waters became rough and choppy, slamming against the sides of the boat with so much force you were all sure that the rest of the journey would be completed by swimming to shore. Sailing into the bay that the Ivory Vale rests in seemed more perilous than the infamous bones that the Ivory Vale became famous for, reaching out of the dark seas like skeletal fingers seeking to pull every passing ship beneath the stormy waters. Legend states that long ago, an ancient dragon fell in battle, and that's where the ivory bones protrude from the ocean. The week-long trip aboard the ship allowed each of you to get to know one another and form a loose friendship between one another. You've all just arrived at the Ivory Vale, a fishing port whose activity has been increasing lately, as more and more people seek to explore the new continent you have just set foot on. Rolling thunder in the distance and gray clouds looming in the heavens mark for a dreary day, but that seems to do little to impact the people of the Ivory Vale. The small town is bustling with businesses. Vendors are selling their wares on the side of the streets. Each of them is shouting louder than the other person next to them, trying to draw your attention. After making your way through the town, each of you finally take refuge at the Lion's Pride Inn. The inn was full of patrons, which were a mixture of citizens of the growing town of the Ivoryville, as well as new adventurers who were here, much like you, seeking out new opportunities to explore these rumors of untapped treasures to be found. Inside, the party heard a wide mixture of stories and rumors ranging from haunted swamps to disappearances of many of the Ivory Vale citizens and explorers who ventured out, but then never returned. Trogdor approaches the bar and orders a steak and potatoes, followed by a drink. The bartender, seeing that he is a dragonborn and that the ratty attire he is wearing, probably a barbarian of some kind, offered to pour a pint of a drink known as the Dragon's Breath, on the condition that he would attempt to slam the drink down. Trogdor, not afraid of a challenge, drinking or otherwise, slammed the drink down and nearly instantly regretted it as the world began to swirl and spin in a dizzying haze. By the time his steak and potatoes had arrived, he was deep into feeling the drink's potent effects, which were mixed with alcohol and various spices to give it that extra punch. He had tried to stab his steak with a fork and found it, in his mind, it was moving around on his plate. Frustrated, he gave a hard thrust at the potato to see if it too would jump out of the way. Striking the side of the potato with his fork, he had sent it flying across the bar where it struck another patron, a man in heavy armor, who immediately took offense and shoved Trogdor Seeing this unfold, Ellie ran up and asked the angry human if she could buy him a drink. The human, seeing the small gnome well equipped, was amused by what he saw and offered to challenge her to a drink to see who falls first, without realizing one of Ellie's flaws in life was that she never turned down a drink, and because of that, had built up quite a tolerance. Needless to say, she quickly drank the human under the table, who, once drunk, had sworn that he and Trogdor had been best friends for years. During all this commotion, Calliope had approached an old wizard that no one seemed to be paying attention to. He was in a corner, seemingly talking to himself, and with a look of extreme concern. Approaching the wizard, Calliope asked if he needed help. The old wizard, with his long, white, unkempt beard which stretches beyond his waistline, strokes his beard thoughtfully. His ice-blue eyes scan over each of you, as if pondering to place his trust in this unusual band of people standing before him, which he had never seen before now.
I live outside the city walls of the Ivory Vale, further south on a farm bordering the Jade Forest. That's where the kobolds came from and chased me out of my house. I'm pretty sure they're after my crystal ball. I'm not sure if they got it, as they swarmed around my house and I was forced to flee.
Calliope asked what the kobolds would want with this crystal ball, and he explained, with eyes shifting about, his tone going lower, that the crystal ball was truly the only thing he had of any value in his home. He couldn't imagine what else they would have been after. Pressing the issue of the crystal ball, Calliope asked about it.
My crystal ball, he stammers, with a bit of uncertainty.
He strokes his beard and he seems to think things over in his head.
Well, you see, it lets me...
He leans in close.
Speak to my dead wife.
You all cast uneasy glances at one another, knowing that the art of necromancy is forbidden. His ice-blue eyes seem to go gray, matching the thundering clouds outside, and you begin to hear rain fall upon the wooden roof of the inn.
My wife died very young, when she was giving birth to my boy. I tried to raise my son, but he needed a mother. Never grew up right in his head, I think because he didn't have his mother's touch.
Looking distraught, he goes on to say,
I admit I did an ancient ritual that summoned her spirit so my son could speak to her to get the closure he needed, but he refused to let go, so I ensnared her soul and imprisoned it within the crystal ball. My son, he went mad with rage over the years and became uncontrollable. He eventually ran away. I've not seen him in 10 years or so.
He pauses and heaves a deep sigh.
I believe the kobolds believe they can use it as a means to speak beyond and unlock the secrets of necromancy. If you can get the crystal ball back, I can reverse the spell and free her soul. Then, if you so wish, I will turn myself in for the art of necromancy.
Knowing that necromancy is forbidden art, Calliope knew that it pained him to reveal the truth about the crystal ball's origins. The wizard went on to explain. The old wizard seems to slump over, broken.
I tried to give the boy what he needed, but nothing I could do was ever enough. He blamed me for his mother's death.
Calliope assured the old man that they would help him recover the crystal ball. She returned and gathered the others, explaining that the old man's crystal ball had been stolen by a band of kobolds, and that they should help recover it for him. Knowing that one of her newly found friends, Phelan, was a cleric of the goddess of life, the bard intentionally left out the parts about necromancy. The party agreed to recover the old man's crystal ball and decided leaving immediately was the best course of action. The rain would already make tracking the kobolds a very difficult task. The dark clouds that threaten rain hide the sun, the moon, and the stars, casting darkness across the land. In the distance, the shadows are briefly disrupted by flashes of lightning in the distance and the rumbling thunder that follows. The ground is thick with mud, and each step taken seems to exert more and more effort than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull your boots from your feet. Traveling south for several hours, the party rests for the night on the edge of the forest trail. While Phelan took watch for the night, she awakens the party to the sounds of what sounds like puppies growling and yipping. Several creatures that appear to be 3.5 feet tall, with reptilian scales holding spears, appear. She immediately recognizes them as kobolds. These small humanoid creatures edged closer, eyes narrowing on each of the party members before launching an attack. Trogdor leaps into battle using his weapon. He eviscerates one completely, smashing it so that not even bones remain. Talaran climbed a tree and launched a volley of arrows. Calliope joined the fight, stabbing one with her rapier. Ellie moved out of the way and shot several with her bow and arrow before taking 2 hits herself. Twerpo unleashed a volley of spells, incinerating several where they stood with magic missile. Before long, only one was left, and it decided fleeing was the better choice. Talaran told the others to let it go, and he, as a ranger, would track it. Staying a little behind the kobold, he marked the trees as he passed them so that his party members could follow him, as Phelan tended to the wounded. He tracked the kobold to an old house where it turned and ran east, staying clear of the farming fields on each side of the beaten-down home. Talaran waited for the party here, spying what appeared to be 4 bodies laying in the field. He suspected that it was more kobolds, that it might be an ambush. He waited for the party to catch up to him and explained what he saw in the field. Trogdor smiled and ran, jumping over the fence and charging the potential attackers hiding in the farmland. However, much to Trogdor's dismay, it was 4 dead kobolds. He examined the bodies and discovered there was no clear indication of what had killed them. They had no puncture wounds or arrows sticking out of them. That's when several of the party members spotted something unusual. The scarecrow next to the bodies, right behind Trogdor, who was too busy searching and looting the kobold bodies, was moving towards him. The enchanted scarecrow attacked Trogdor. A second scarecrow in the other fields began lumbering over, also triggered by the unwanted presence in the field. Calliope was stunned and shaken by the sight of these unusual creatures. She was frozen with fear. Ellie launched a volley of arrows at each of them as Phelan stood next to her launching her crossbow bolts. Talaran fired a number of arrows at them, and Twerpo unleashed fire-based spells, hoping to catch them on fire. When a third scarecrow came lumbering over, Ellie grabbed a rope and tied it to the fence and began running around it to try to trip it. Talaran spotted a 4th and final one approaching, even though the other 3 were still standing. It was a long, hard fight, but the party eventually overcame the beast and took shelter in a home, which they recognized as the old man's home based on this description he had given. A quick search of the home revealed paintings of him and his son, who was still young in these paintings, and they found volumes of necromancy books. When Phelan asked if Calliope knew if the man was practicing necromancy, the bard quickly changed the subject. The party rested here to regain health and regain spells for the night, knowing they'd be tracking the kobold east into the Blackland swamps, which were rumored to be haunted.